Carl Haltman, Executive Director at Hokyoji, and welcome to our Sunday morning Dharma talk. And this morning we have Reverend Shodo Spring. She is a Dharma heir of Shohaku Okumura. She first met the Dharma through Katagiri Roshi. Shodo's practice focuses on our relationship with all sentient beings through an organization called Mountains and Waters Alliance. In 1988, she spent a year at Hokyoji with just the trees and hills of sangha. And in 2013, she walked across the Great Plains with a small group. She's working on her second book. So welcome, Shodo, and take it away.
Hey, thank you.
There we are.
Okay, so I had originally said that I was going to talk about self, and that was a pretty interesting subject, I thought. But something happened. So I am going to spend at least the first part of my talk remembering Thich Nhat Hanh, who died on Friday. It would seem impossible to do otherwise. I met him just once, or I heard him speak rather. And that was in Berkeley, California on September 13th, 2001, when everyone was in shock from the attack on the towers. Before that, many people I knew had studied with him. People were talking about him everywhere, and I wasn't quite sure what the deal was. It was wonderful that he was, it was wonderful that he was the founder of that thing that we call engaged Buddhism, which has been the guiding force in my Buddhist practice for many years. But when I heard him that day, I understood his presence was amazing. So that's the first thing I want to say. Facebook has been full of photos of him. And the one that I liked the best was a very casual one. I thought it was of him as a very young man. He had hair. He was wearing a sweater. And when I looked to make sure that it was a photo of him, I discovered that he was 48 years old in this photo where he looks like he's in his 20s. It was quite wonderful. And I thought, what living a life, the life he lived, made that face. Also made the face that we see in all those pictures all the time, where he looks so serene. In this one, he looks like somebody you'd like to be friends with. Just smiling and happy and full of life. So, so I looked up his biography so I could just outline that. He was born in 1926. He became a monk at age 16. And in the early 1950s, he was actively engaged in the movement to renew Vietnamese Buddhism. He was one of the first bhikshus to study a secular subject at university, and one of the first 6 monks to ride a bicycle. This is all from the Plum Village website. So later, war came to Vietnam, and they had to decide what to do. he wrote that there was a time when he thought about becoming a Marxist because the Marxists were doing something. And the monks were kind of sitting in the temple. And he said he's very grateful that, I think he would say he's very grateful that he had mindfulness, because when he thought about it, he realized that if he became a Marxist, at some point, he would be subject to party discipline, and he would have to do things such as kill people that were in violation of his primary vow. And so he didn't, but he found a sort of middle way, and he named it, and he created a space for everyone who came after. I don't particularly think he's the only person who, or the first person who made this space, but he's the one who brought it to the West. In 1961, he came to the United States. He taught comparative religion at Princeton. And the next year, he taught at Columbia University. And then back in Vietnam in the early 60s, he founded the School of Youth and Social Service. And in this school, they practiced and they acted. He writes about a time when 5 participants in that school went to deliver food somewhere, and they were ambushed and shot because they were in that school. One of them survived and came back to say that the soldier who shot them said, "I'm sorry," but he still shot them. He was illegal. Most of his actions were illegal. He was not welcome by either of the 2 major parties in his country. And I was thinking what a good thing that would be to not be welcomed by either side. It would not be a pleasant thing, but it made me think maybe I could stop trying to find someone who would accept me. I mean, there are people who accept me, but maybe I could stop trying to find inroads to the people on one side or the other. So, he says this organization had 10,000 volunteers. And he wrote, meditation is not to escape from society, but to come back to ourselves and see what is going on. Once there is seeing, there must be acting. With mindfulness, we know what to do and what not to do to help. So before I go further, I'm going to go back because he wrote about his mother dying. And this seems like it was an important turning point in his life or later. So I don't know when he wrote this, but he said, the day my mother died, I wrote in my journal, a serious misfortune of my life has arrived. I suffered for more than 1 year after the passing away of my mother. But one night in the highlands of Vietnam, I was sleeping in the hut in my hermitage. I dreamed of my mother. I saw myself sitting with her, and we were having a wonderful talk. She looked young and beautiful, her hair flowing down. It was so pleasant to sit there and talk to her as if she had never died. When I woke up, it was about 2 in the morning, and I felt very strongly that I had never lost my mother. The impression that my mother was still with me was very clear. I understood then that the idea of having lost my mother was just an idea. It was obvious in that moment that my mother is always alive in me. I opened the door and went outside. The entire hillside is bathed in moonlight. It was a hill covered with tea plants, and my hut was set behind the temple halfway up. walking slowly in the moonlight through the rows of tea plants, I noticed my mother was still with me. It was the moonlight caressing me, as she had done so often. Very tender, very sweet, wonderful. Each time my feet touched the earth, I knew my mother was there with me. I knew this body was not mine, but a living continuation of my mother and my father and my grandparents and great-grandparents, of all my ancestors. Those feet that I saw as my feet were actually our feet. Together, my mother and I were leaving footprints in the damp soil. From that moment on, the idea that I had lost my mother no longer existed. All I had to do was look at the palm of my hand, feel the breeze on my face or the earth under my feet, to remember that my mother is always with me, available at any time. This is a sort of description of an experience of the way that we are not separate, the way that we are created by our past and by everything around us. And there is no loneliness in this way of being. So Thich Nhat Hanh, he had returned to Vietnam to join in the resistance, basically, to teach and to offer relief services through the School of Youth and Social Services. And it was in 1966 when he received transmission. All these other things he seemed to have done as what we would call a student monk. In 1966, he went to the United States and Europe on what he thought would be a 3-month trip to speak for peace. He met Martin Luther King, and both North and South Vietnam sent him into exile. He was not welcome anymore, and he was exiled for 39 years. And again, he wrote about that time, how painful it was, and how he struggled, how he missed the lands, the trees, I'm sure just the air of Vietnam. And he struggled and struggled to see beauty in the lands of Europe, and I'm sure in the people of Europe. So he just kept traveling and speaking. In 1969, he led a Buddhist delegation to the Paris Peace Talks. And finally, in 1975, he established a community near Paris, and in 1982, started Plum Village, which is now, it has 200 resident monastics and over 10,000 visitors every year. Somebody, I think it was Kyoku, said that energy that you feel in Thich Nhat Hanh is still there in Plum Village. There's a gentleness. There's a happiness. There's smiling. And Buddhism is often thought of as focusing on suffering. And one of the things that Thich Nhat Hanh gave to Buddhism was a sense of joy. And again, it's not that he's the only one who knew about the joy, but he was his foremost voice. And because he constantly spoke, he wrote poetry that evoked presence and beauty and joy. He taught us walking meditation. And he taught it well enough that one can actually receive that teaching one can actually find a way to set one foot on the ground and another foot on the ground and feel the joy, feel the nourishment of the earth. When I walked through the Great Plains along the KXL route, I remember placing my feet. And about the first month, I would put a foot on the ground and place my staff on the ground and feel the energy coming up from the earth to support me. And I would receive nourishment. And because that walk was thought of as an action, as an activist thing, the next evolution was thinking, when I placed my foot on the ground, that I would send energy into the ground. And finally, these two came together. And so I would have the experience of both receiving, being entirely given, being created, being life given to me, and of giving life back, giving love and nourishment back to the entire earth in each specific place where I put my foot. And you know, you do that in a specific place. You can also send loving attention and loving intention to the world as a whole. But to do it with this one little piece of ground, or road, pavement, gravel, grass, whatever it may be, you get to notice that you're doing it. There's a quality that's very full of life. And one of his first books was, I think it was called Pieces Every Step, but it was about walking meditation with pictures. And it described this in a way that invited us into it. And one of my earliest memories of Hokyoji was at a women's retreat, and Byakuren was leading us in walking meditation in that style. And it was amazingly beautiful. I chose not to run for my camera. And since then, I've thought of that picture that I didn't take and share. So I want to offer a little bit of his teachings beyond his story. And one of the things that he says in this last book, he says, the Five Remembrances are really good. And what he says is, in Buddhism, we have a meditation to face and transform our fears called the Five Remembrances. I am of the nature to grow old. There is no way to escape growing old. I am of the nature to have ill health. There is no way to escape having ill health. I am of the nature to die. There is no way to escape death. All that is dear to me and everyone I love is of the nature to change. There is no way to escape being separated from them. I inherit the results of my actions of body, speech, and mind. My actions are my continuation.